I recently got a comment on one of my videos that pretty much disturbed me. And in it, the person said that black people don't appreciate art and literature. And when I think about that, I think about the impact on the bigger picture. You see, art and literature are a major component of history. And if you don't appreciate art and literature, guess what? Somebody else is going to be telling your story in history, because art is how people visually depict our stories and our experiences and make commentary on what's going on. And literature is how people tell stories regarding what transpired during a certain period. So they give us a historical perspective of what went on in a certain period in a certain age. This is why art and literature are very important, and most civilizations always make efforts to preserve their art and their literature, because when you preserve your art and your literature, you're preserving a part of your history and giving people an insight into the issues that went on during a certain era. And when you protect and preserve that, you have something that you have a culture that you can teach the children of the next generation regarding what happened with their ancestors in the past. And this is something that your Afro American Negro just doesn't understand regarding art and literature. Art and literature are essential to a culture. And if you do not appreciate them, somebody else, again, will be telling your story. And this is what happens with African Americans. We blow off our art, we blow off our literature, and what happens is white people wind up telling our stories and presenting our experience from their view. This is why I say we see black through a white lens, because we don't make the efforts to protect the black perspective and the black view. And this is why I believe literature is very important. This is why I got into publishing in the first place, because I understand that if we don't make an effort to protect and preserve our stories and our history, our culture, somebody else is going to be telling our story. And in most cases, when other people tell our story, we often get an unbalanced, skewed picture that literally presents and perpetuates old stereotypes regarding African Americans. Case in point, the 1930s, with all the images of coons, minstrels, mammies, Jezebels. That's how white people view black people. And if it wasn't for institutions like the Johnson Publications and black writers during the Harlem Renaissance, we would not get that balanced picture of what it meant to be an African American from that Jim Crow period. We would not get any, accurate images regarding the African American and the African American struggle. We would not get the balanced story. All the stories would be one way. And this is why we have to make every effort to protect our artists, our writers, and, preserve our institutions, because if we don't value those institutions, somebody else is going to take them and use them to their own advantage. And that's a case in point we're seeing right now in 2015 with Johnson Publications, which is now in some serious financial trouble, and they were getting ready to sell off, their whole archive of photos regarding images that they presented in Ebony magazine and all their publications. What's going to happen is, if these images wind up in somebody else's hand, in a white and non-black hands, what they're going to do is they're going to take those images and manipulate them to fit their narrative. So instead of us getting that balanced picture of the African American experience, we're going to be getting some white person's view of what they want black to be. And this is why it's important for us to protect our art and our literature, because if you don't protect your art and your literature, again, you're not going to have that historical picture that gives people perspective of what it meant to be black for a certain period of time, and how that picture of then relates to today. Because if we don't have that balanced picture, then how can we teach the next generation what it means to be black in this society? And this is why we have to value, our art and our literature. This is why we have to make efforts to share our art and our literature with each other. And this is why we have to control our image, because if we don't value the image of what black is, guess what? Somebody else is going to take your image and devalue it. And the only reason why they can devalue your image is because you don't value your image. And if you don't value your image, guess what? They're going to take your image and present it the way they want it to be presented. And that's what's going on. That's what's been going on for the last 15 years. We've had these sold out black people like your Lee Daniels and your Tyler Perry teaming up with white liberals to present their interpretation and their idea of what it is to be black. And their interpretation of ideas are all presenting an African American as some sort of victim who needs to be cleaned up and needs to be helped up, instead of us seeing, balanced images of black people who can do for themselves, who persevere, who run into issues and run into obstacles, but yet overcome those obstacles without having to make the usual excuses of white supremacy, racism, or some phantom person who does them wrong. This is what the black narrative has become over the last 20-25 years. And I believe that that's not an accurate picture of what African Americans actually are. I believe that the picture of what African Americans are, we barely skim the surface of that African American experience when it comes down to mainstream media. You don't get half of the stories of what it means to be African American at all. I mean, that's why I publish so many different types of books, like your Thetas about African American sorority, or your Spinsterella about African American goths, or your books in the ISIS series which feature an African American heroine, or your All About Maryland's, which is about African American actresses, or your Temptation of John Haynes, which is about an African American fantasy, because I believe that there's more than one shade of black, more than one texture of black, and more than one black experience. And the sad part is, when we don't value our art and our literature, we never get to see those different shades and textures, and we never get that balanced picture of what it means to be an African American. Instead, we get this lopsided, one-sided view of African American, and in that view, all you see is some guy in the hood, some guy from the streets, some guy with sagging pants, or some black woman who can't find a man, or some thug. It's a very, very narrow picture, and there's more to it than that picture, and we need to see more than that. And the reason why I try to do all these different stories, because I feel that we need those different stories, because they give us a more balanced picture, a more balanced perspective, and we get to see, that there is more than one shade and more than one texture, and that black is a broad thing, not some narrow, confined thing that is only related to the hood, to the streets, and to the ghetto. There's more to black than that, and we need to start seeing that bigger picture. But in the eyes of many African Americans, they have been so brainwashed by Madison Avenue advertisers and Hollywood movie studios that they don't see that bigger picture. Instead, whenever you try to present them with that broader picture of African American, they say that you're acting white. I mean, they even say people like me act white because I'm speaking to you in an articulate manner. Oh, you're acting white. No, you're not acting white. This is the way educated intelligent people speak to each other. This is the way I speak to my family at the dinner table, and this is the way they exchange dialogue with me. This is the way we talk to each other. And this is something that you don't see presented on a regular basis regarding African Americans. I mean, this is all related to us not controlling our art and our literature, because when we control our art and our literature, again, we control our history and we control our culture, and then more importantly, we can teach our history and teach our culture. And that's something every other society does. They make every effort to protect and preserve their art and their literature and preserve their culture, because they know if you lose your culture, somebody else will start teaching your culture. And when you're being taught your culture by a non-black person, guess what? You're learning their views, and their views may not be the most beneficial to you regarding your own art and your own literature and your own culture. Because I've seen this happen, with the way they teach several, books like your Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God. I saw how people totally distorted this book, how white feminists and black feminists like Alice Walker took this book and twisted it to fit their narrative. And what they wanted to do was take this book, which was about a black woman who was raised by a single mother, by her single grandmother, and taught a whole bunch of dysfunctional ideologies, and they twisted it to turn it into a misandristic, black man bashing, diatribe about how black men were doing this woman wrong, when we never got to see the other side, which was all the choices that this girl made in her life regarding men because of the way she was taught about men. And that pretty much flew over people's heads again because we didn't control the narrative regarding our literature. This book has been taught for at least 25, 30 years in public schools, and people have learned, a miseducated narrative regarding this book and a misinterpretation of this book. And this is, again, because we didn't value our art and our literature. And I'll give you another example of us not valuing our art and our literature. I look at hip-hop. That was our art form, and that was created by your Cool Hercs and your Africa Bombadas to be a positive forum for African Americans to express themselves. It was about preaching a message of personal responsibility, personal taking care of your community, protecting your community, and supporting community through a rhythm and poetry message. But because we didn't value it, and we didn't value the artistic expression of it, white liberals came in, hijacked it through gangster rap and groups like your NWA, and since then, the message of hip-hop has gone from personal responsibility to that of Negro victimization. And that was all because, again, we didn't value what we produce. And this is something that we have to understand. And I'll say it, I know people hate me repeating, but I'm going to keep saying it. Your art and your literature make up a core component of your history. And if you do not value your art and your literature, you're putting your history in the hands of somebody else for them to teach your children. And when they teach your children your art and your history, guess what? They're not going to give you the fair and balanced picture of your art and your history. They're going to give you their interpretation of your art and your history. And when they give you their interpretation, guess what you're going to get? You're going to get what you get right now, which is a victimized narrative that tells you that black people are poor, miserable, downtrodden, and they need some white savior to come and save them, which wasn't the case. I mean, you can look at your history during the Reconstruction period, and you can see that black people didn't need some savior to come save them. They were building their own towns, they were building their own businesses, they were building their own infrastructure, and you can still do that right now. The opportunities are there, but because, people don't value these things, they don't care about them. Because they don't care about them, they don't see how they fit into a bigger picture. And I really believe that black people have to start looking at that bigger picture, regarding their life, because art and literature are two powerful things. This is how you learn, a sense of yourself, a sense of your ideas, because this is how I learned through art and literature. I grew up with comic books, and I grew up with looking at different pieces of art regarding African American art, and I read a lot of different things, not just books, but nonfiction, magazine articles, comic books, and they gave me that picture of what it was to be African American, and then what I got was a balanced picture of what it was to be African American. And you know what? I grew up in the worst part of the South Bronx. I grew up on 167th Street and Park Avenue, right next to the Metro North railroad tracks, and somehow, thank God, I still learned a balanced picture of what it was to be African American, even though I lived in that neighborhood and lived around drug addicts and junkies as a kid and grew up on welfare. I still got that balanced picture of what it was to be African American, and that's why it's so important to me, to come out here and continue to publish these type of books, because I want the next generation to get a balanced picture of what it is to be African American and to get that sense of identity, because your art and your culture, your art and your literature are major components of the culture that is taught to you. And you have to have a value and an understanding of your art and your culture if you expect to, have a sense of self. And if you're not presented with this on a regular basis, then you're going to get a really unbalanced and distorted picture. And I've seen an entire generation, grow up with an unbalanced and distorted picture of what it means to be African American. They have no understanding, of how broad African American culture is. They have no understanding of how big African American culture is. They have no understanding of how the power of African American art and how what type of stories people use to tell, regarding African American culture, and or how African American literature directly relates to African American history, because these commentaries are giving us a clear and accurate picture of what went on during a certain period. All of these novels, if you take an English lit course, they talk about this in depth. A lot of people, they do this with your Jane Austens and your Charles Dickens. That's what those books were. They were commentaries on the time. And just like in sci-fi, with Rod Serling in the Twilight Zone, he was making a commentary about the time that the 1950s were, the Cold War. That's what that science fiction was. It was a quiet commentary on that. And that's why you have to value, your art and your literature, because they're telling you stories that you would not get in a newspaper or a magazine. And there are things in between the lines that are there for us to learn from what transpires in these stories. And you have to understand that there's a value there. And there's something that most African Americans, we're so busy thinking about clothes and cars and superficial, we're not thinking about, the impact of this art and literature on us as a people. Because as a people, this is what we are taught, and this is what we teach our children, and eventually, this is what is left for people to see, regarding a certain time period, regarding the African American experience. And it's something we really need to really think about and, start to value and to appreciate a whole lot more, because, again, art and literature are a major part of history. They're a major part of teaching culture. They're a major part of teaching people about themselves. And they're a major part of, helping people to understand what the black experience is and how it relates to the overall picture, historical picture, in a broader perspective. That's all I have to say for this video. I have a lot of great books on Amazon.com. All of my books are positive African American fiction and nonfiction, and will help you enrich your life and elevate yourself. On the ebook form, they're as low as 99 cents, but I urge you to go get the paperback. It may only cost $10 or $11, but it is so worth it, because you're going to be getting a positive perspective of African American history, African American culture, and, some social commentary. I have a lot of great titles. Again, all you have to do is click the link in the description box, and I'm urging you to go and get the paperbacks. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.